Welcome to Cover to Cover Book Meet. I'm your host, Roger Nichols, and this is author interview number 863. Our guest today has been there, done that, and has the photos to prove it. In his case, that means more than 1 million of them. Jason Edwards is a photographer, National Geographic, who has worked all over the world in situations from sublime to life-threatening. Among the ways captured images of a world in change and not always for the better. The sad thing is, future photographers may not have the same chances to get the same shots Jason did as human expansion closes down habitat and species wink out of existence. But he's not just about animal and plant kingdoms, he also chronicles the human experience as well. And now he's collected stunning images from that career in his latest National Geographic book, Icebergs to Iguanas, Photographic Journeys Around the World. We're very pleased to welcome Jason Edwards.
Good morning or good afternoon your time. How are you?
Yeah, indeed. Before we dig into the book, which is world class, I must say, I want to find a little bit more about you as a person. One of the questions I often ask authors is, were they always going to be an author? But I think I have the feeling you were always going to be a photographer from an early age, and I think there's a high school yearbook to thank for that.
There is. Well, it actually began even earlier than that. I went on a school excursion at 8 and I took my mother's, remember those Kodak canister cameras that had the little
Yeah,
canister film in them?
yeah.
And we went to the airport here in Melbourne and they let children on the tarmac back then. And we got to go up to a Pan Am 747, can you believe it? And I took my first ever photos there. Then they let us on the jet. And my first photos were me looking out the window across that vast grey wing. And I took a photo of that. Who would have ever thought I'd spend thousands of hours looking out of that same scene? So that's where it started. And then it continued in high school where I started shooting again with mum's old canister camera until I used my paper round money to buy my first camera and had images published off the third roll of film. So I was hooked on editorial then, and I was probably 14 or 15 at that point.
Well, I have to ask you this. Do you remember the first photo that somebody actually paid you for?
I do actually. I remember the first one that was ever published was jumping forward when I was a zookeeper, but
Uh-huh.
it was actually a picture of a maned wolf, which is a South American species that I cared for at the time, and it went on the back of a science journal. They got that one for free, but then not long after that, one of the encyclopedias started buying few images from me to go very tiny postage stamp in the encyclopedias, and I made a little bit of money out of that, which was surreal in the extreme to be paid to make a picture.
Cool. I have one oddball question for you, probably more than one, but this is the one. I mean, you have access to more than 1 million photos you shot yourself, and plus all the reserves of all the National Geographic. What do you have on the wallpaper on your computer?
Grey. Literally grey. I mean, if it goes to sleep, the wallpaper comes up with a default, but the background's just a neutral grey, so that if I have to look at pictures when I'm in the field, I'm not seeing them altered by the colours on my background.
Okay, I just had to ask that weird question. So,
Yeah.
what do you spend? Tell me a little bit about the years you spent at the Melbourne Zoo, because you were there for a while.
I was there for 12 years. So during my high school years when I started shooting, I didn't study photography at all. My school didn't even offer it. So I did the sciences, chemistry, physics, biology, maths, English,
Mhm.
but I also did art and art history. And everyone thought I loved to paint and draw. That was actually the premise for my creativity.
Hmm.
And I wasn't so much concerned about what belonged in an image in the composition. I was very fixated on what didn't belong in my compositions. And given surrealism and fantasy were my genres, especially surrealism, everything has to be in the right place when you're doing surrealism. So it was one of those scenarios that at the end of high school, I wrote a letter to Melbourne Zoo, which is the second oldest zoo in the world, to London, and I got the pro forma back, no positions available, and then 3 months later, I got a letter saying, "Can you come for an interview?" And that was on the Tuesday, and I started on the Thursday, and um, and I was there for basically 12 years, and I was a keeper, and I worked my first 6 months with native animals, kangaroos, wombats, koalas, but then moved across to carnivores. So I was the big cat keeper and bears and everything for about 8 years. And then from there, I went to work with primates, gorillas and orangutans and arboreal primates for another 4 years. But it was during that time I did my tertiary studies. So I actually studied applied science, animal sciences, things like that. And all of my photographic experience came from trial and error, shooting the old Kodak Gold 100 originally, and then as you would know well, Kodachrome 64, the original Kodachrome, which was the staple of National Geographic and the
Yeah.
most beautiful film ever made, and so I cut my teeth in the furnace of Kodachrome for all those years at the zoo, which taught me to read light because that film is so unforgiving.
That's the other thing I was going to ask is that experience working with animals of all sorts in captivity help you out in the wild when you're looking at them?
Very much so. I mean, I grew up in what really is like was a halfway house for injured wildlife.
Mhm.
So my father was one of these long haul truck drivers, these famous Aussie truck drivers with the big rigs, and he would find owls and injured joeys, baby kangaroos, and things like that, and bring them home. And where we grew up at that time, the suburbs hadn't reached us, so there was always snakes in the backyard and reptiles and frogs, and so I was always surrounded by wildlife growing up, and I didn't know anything different. And then having a position at Melbourne Zoo meant that all day, every day, I was surrounded by wildlife and reading their behaviour and things like that. And I think when I started traveling independently, so once I got my job at the zoo, the money that I earned from the zoo went into buying film and lenses and just the cheapest of cheapest equipment. People get caught up now in buying amazing lenses, but I was buying lenses for $50 and camera bodies for whatever, and I would just take myself off. I'd buy a ticket somewhere in the world and I'd take off and go to Africa or South America or whatever the case was, and hone my craft through trial and error. But that immersion, I guess, to your point, that immersion of being a lifetime surrounded by wildlife means that today I'm never complacent, but that's all I know. It's what I do. I love working with people in indigenous cultures and ancient history. That's all wonderful. But when I'm in ecosystems where my brain just basically taps into another part of who I am, there's quite a duality to my personality, and I'll be working with big cats in the wild or elephants or whatever, snakes in jungles or whatever the case might be. It doesn't mean things can't go wrong, but that 3+ decades of hands-on very much gives me means my instincts with wildlife are turned on more than probably what most people's are.
I suspect your instincts with people are due as well, because one of the things you mentioned in the book is that you said you always carry a little bribery money because it's necessary.
Correct. Yeah, very much so. And I mean, some shoots the bribery budget gets chewed up pretty quickly. And these days, we're all forced to sign contracts that says that you're not allowed to bribe anyone. But I can absolutely guarantee you, everyone has money that spends a lot of time in the field, to get yourself in and out of difficulties. But I mean, one of the things that I've always found with humanity is that people basically, and this is difficult for some people to hear, I'm sure, but people are just another species on the planet, and we have the same concerns and fears, fight or flight. Um, we people always want the same for their children wherever they are. They just want food and education and for their children to have it better than them.
Yeah.
And when I don't speak the language, which of course is very often the case, you need hand signals and a smile and a wave or a gesture, but you have to have that same instinct turned on in unstable locations because it does go sideways. And sometimes the worst thing to do is pull out money because that's the thing that's going to get you into more trouble than actually not pulling it out. So as I've gotten older, I think I've gotten better at that,
Mhm.
and I'm much more slow on the draw to pull the money out now, and I'd rather give someone money as a thank you
Yeah.
than an offer to get me out of trouble. I prefer to use my wits and my contacts to try and get out of trouble, but then give someone some support for actually a service provided if that's what's actually happened.
I have to ask what it meant for you when you were able to step up to some finer equipment, because there's one point where you talk, I just love this, where you talk about doing macro bites, turning the lens around and holding it against that by sheer force.
Yeah, yeah, that's that.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing, and all of those things have been lost, I think, to the generations now that For those who haven't read the book yet, I used to reverse my 50 mm lens and hold it over the hole in the camera body and then move my body in and out until the image was in focus. And, people go, what? How could you do that? But what it taught me to do was it taught me depth of field, how much was in focus super close, but also how to be steady, and because it's so hard to be steady in slow shutter speed. So one of my nicknames is the human tripod. So I can hand hold 800 and 1,000 mm lenses at, for whatever it's worth to some people, a sixth of a second, but when the gear eventually got better, I never get caught up in the upgrade wars. So whenever I buy equipment, I will buy whatever the best is at that time, not because it's the best, but normally it's just made a bit more rugged
Mhm.
than the other tiers. And then I will run that gear until it falls apart 50 times. And the people that rebuild my gear, they can tell you horror stories, but I will keep rebuilding that gear again and again and again until the point where they turn around and say, look, Jace, this is done. There's no more rebuilds. Only then will I upgrade, because it's a costly exercise. And when you're in the field, as I am, months and months every year, the gear has to be able to survive being frozen at -30 or 100% humidity in a rainforest or in the sands of a desert somewhere in the world.
Yeah.
So I need it to be a tool that I can rely on
Mhm.
and not just pack up at the slightest impact.
Yeah. So I have to ask, and I don't think you mentioned anywhere in the book, but are you still using film totally, or are
I
you doing?
am.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I very much am. Actually, just right behind me here on the table is a lead film bag.
Oh my
Uh,
goodness.
and That's got film in it from the shoot I just landed from. But what I do now, I still shoot film on every assignment, but I like to slow it down, and I'll shoot panoramic on
Mhm.
film, on color transparency, and I actually hand hold that camera. I hate tripods with a passion, but I'll hand hold that camera and use it almost like a Leica. It's a Hasselblad, and it's very old. It's been rebuilt 100 times, and there's no black left on it. It's all silver now. I'd show you, but it's in the office.
Yeah.
Um, and I love film because, again, probably a controversial line would be that the photographer you are on film, to me, is the photographer that you are, because digital's so forgiving. So now Kodak's manufacturing again. Fuji always was, Ilford, and a whole raft of other brands,
Mhm.
and Nikon and Canon are both producing film cameras again. It's wonderful. It's not going to overtake digital, but for people who are really passionate about photography and want to slow the process down and actually see how they're reading the light, the only way to do that is on film, because it's so unforgiving compared to digital.
Right. I think people might compare that the way that vinyl is making a bit of a comeback in compared to digital as well.
Very much so. And the feel is different. And I know in the fine art genre that people who are shooting on film, or at least in my experience from what I've seen, they're actually getting much higher prices for their work than someone who is shooting digitally. Now, technically, that's shouldn't be the case, but it is, because I think people have realized that it's a lot more work. And just this week when I landed, I had a conversation with someone from one of the universities, and they had a student who decided at the last minute to shoot their final portfolio on film,
Mhm.
which is great. Except they'd just done four previous years of shooting digitally. So when they got all the work back, the color was different, the pictures weren't as sharp, all of these things, because the photographer they are on film is a lot less than the photographer they are on digital. So apparently there was a lot of tears last week when that happened. So but that's life. It's I'm blessed, I think, to in many ways, but to have had that transition from Ilford black and white, through the Kodak golds into the Kodachromes,
Mhm.
and then into the Ektachromes, the E100s and things like that, that will mean probably not a lot to a lot of people, and then of course into digital. And I was a late adopter to digital because I just love film so much. I mean,
Mhm.
if we could keep it for medicine and space and all of those sorts of things, and you gave me the giant Ronald Reagan red button and said, "Do you want to turn off?" They're showing my age, isn't it? You want to turn off digital now. I'd be hitting that red button before you could even say it, because The not only was the market different, but I think photographers had more connection with what they were creating in some ways than they do now, where it's so instantaneous.
At some point, you had to say, I think I'm going to make this good. I can safely leave my job at the zoo.
Mm.
What was that feeling like at the time? Were you happy? Or are you scared? How'd it work?
Yeah, actually, the probably the background response to that would be devastated,
Mhm.
for a couple of reasons. One was that I'd had, as we regard them here under the Westminster system, the British system, a marriage by common law, or a couple of marriages by common law.
Mhm.
Excuse me, and I'd spent 10 years, literally 10 years. I would get up at a couple of hours before zoo would start. I lived very close, like half a mile to the zoo.
Hmm.
So I'd get up, I'd do a couple of hours work, go to the zoo. My morning tea and my lunch and my afternoon tea were all spent on the business, on the photographic business. I'll explain that in a second. And then I'd get home in the afternoon and I would work for a couple of hours, spend time with my partner, have dinner, and then I'd start working until about 3 in the morning. Now, I did that 7 days a week for 10 years. And in response to your question, is that eventually, when I was in Western India on assignment, the relationship folded.
Hmm.
And so she decided, and I'm grateful now that that happened because I found a healthier relationship, but it was devastating. I felt like my world had collapsed around me. But I also realized at that time that was there, I was doing so many hours and I was using all my annual leave to travel and shoot stories and things like that. But was it ever going to change? And so that separation from my partner was actually enough to of an impetus for me to bail. And that's the thing I think people
Wow.
don't realize to build in any industry, and I'm sure you've had these experiences yourself, is that, if you're trying to break into something or to succeed in something, there's often a lot of casualties along the way.
Wow.
And family and friends and partners were often that because of the amount of hours I was working. But it was also during my time at the zoo that I started a stock agency. And so I decided there had to be a platform by which to market my work because companies would call the zoo and say, does the zoo have a picture of a lion, an elephant, whatever? And they'd say,
Mhm.
look, we've got this young guy here, Jace. Here's his phone number, call him. And they'd just flip them to me. So I started selling pictures through the zoo. They not actually through them, but the contacts through them. And one year I spent 6 months of my salary on a copyright lawyer. And during that contract development process, we produced something that was quite brutal, to be honest, because I was sending them the Kodachromes. I was sending them, my IP.
Yeah.
And there was a contract clause in there that said if you didn't publish my name, so Jason Edwards, and my stock agency at the time was Bio Images, so bio's Latin for all living things. If
Mhm.
you didn't write Jason Edwards Bio Images, I billed you an extra 100%.
Oh.
And so that way my name got out there. There was no internet, there was nothing like that. And so that 10 years of building bio images and making money from stock sales, and I would go and shoot it if I didn't have it, and then selling pictures and all of those things. When I actually left, in my mind, and this sounds stupid now, in my mind I went, now I'm going to have all this free time.
Okay.
But everyone says that, don't they? Everyone says, well, when I give up one thing, I'll have more time. But you don't.
Yeah.
You get on more planes or you do more work or whatever the case might be. But excuse me, but I do remember coming home from that assignment and I can make light of it now, but my house was empty and even the house keys were gone.
Ooh, ugly.
Yeah, there was a plastic fork and a glass left. The glass didn't match any of our other sets, and the plastic fork had a tooth missing.
Okay.
So it was pretty brutal to start again at that time for the second time. But I think when you look back at your life's journey, these things for everyone, regardless of the
Mhm.
scenario or what govern who we become as adults and the path that we're on. And potentially if that hadn't have happened, and I'm so grateful that it did because I have a loving wife and a son and everything now, but I think had that not have happened, I'm not too sure that I would have had the strength to make the another 10 years of sacrifice that on top of the 10 that I had. I may have buckled out of love, maybe.
Mhm. It's interesting because you mentioned that when you finally made the call to National Geographic, you said, we've been waiting for this call. This is
Yeah.
what all your strategy has done, has made you a desired commodity.
that was right, and that was probably one of those most surreal moments in my career, and maybe in my life, and that I just didn't feel I was ready for so long. That's one of the things, one of the advents of digital, is that it's so instantaneous and people are so good at post-production. I mean, 99.9999% of people are better at post than I am. I don't know how to do layers or dodging and burning or anything. I've had assistants that I haven't allowed to do those things. We basically are done in 17 seconds on a file. I'll
Wow.
show anyone a raw, anyone a transparency. I don't care. I'm the only one at Nat Geo that'll do that. And if the shot I get is the shot you see. So when I rang Nat Geo, I finally felt that, okay, let's make the call. Not just because I'd left the zoo, but let's just see what happens. And when they put me through to the director of wildlife photography at the time, and her opening line is, "I've been waiting for you to call," it was like, okay, it was, the universe went a little still at that moment, and they asked me to submit it. They said, "What's your story proposal?" I gave one. I submitted some images for it, transparencies, and then they had me shoot another 3 or 4 stories towards it, and then broke that story up. It didn't fit the publishing schedule, but they broke it up, used it in the magazine, and then invited me to Washington to bring 150 frames that I thought told the story of my career at that point. And I mean, I was young. I was the baby. There's always a baby, but I was the
Yeah.
baby. And I remember the night before I flew to DC. I'd never been to DC before. My floor of my house was covered in transparencies, and my housemate's there. We got bottles of wine, and he's going, "You've got to put this in, you've got to put this in." And so when I turned up and it was a mix of shots, people often wonder, what would you pick? Well, you pick the shots that people like as a
Mhm.
starting point, that magazines or books had been liking at that point. But also too, more importantly, I think I picked all the shots that I liked, and then there were some that no one had ever understood. I loved them, but people didn't comprehend there was something in the shot, not because it was confusing, but the composition was complex or something. And during that first editorial review, the editor said, a great line for my career was, "How does your mind think like that?" So,
Yeah.
that was interesting. And then I presented those images 44 times over the next 10 days in different departments of Geographic.
Wow.
So it was all those years of them watching me in the background, shooting stories and stills and everything for other people. So vetting me from afar, and then me turning up in person and saying, "This is how I see my contribution," and then deciding if I fit the family. And that was 2001, so 24 years ago. So
That's fantastic. I have to mention, you told one interviewer about a connection with David Attenborough, I understand.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it was interesting because the first book I ever did was a child. Part of Bioimages was supplying a lot of imagery to children's educational publishers around the world.
Mhm.
And maybe it's my genetic immaturity, but I often shot a lot of material that was self-explanatory, which is great when you want to take kids on a journey.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so probably the biggest part of that income stream through Bioimages was educational. And so I ended up writing, one of the major publishers, that ended up getting bought out by Oxford, had me write a book on a journey through African ecosystems. And so lots of fun facts. And it was based on an actual journey, that months of hiking through different countries that I'd done. Um, and it must have come across the desk of Sir David Attenborough. And then I get this letter from the UK one day, and here's this letter from Sir David saying, "Jason, the book is wonderful. Da, 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 da," this handwritten letter from Sir David Attenborough. And it was one of those things where, and he put in the letter, "I don't use the stills, guys. We just work in videos, but you must keep going, you must do this, da, da, da." That's life changing. And I might have been, I don't even know how old I was at that point, but in my 20s at some point, I think. And then I got a lovely, he received a copy of, through a friend, he received a copy of Icebergs to Iguanas. And then I got a letter from him, this year saying, "Jason, I'm going to sit down with a cup of tea and read this cover to cover, David," sort of thing. So it was interesting because that book, that the African ecosystem book, was the first time I'd ever been in Africa, and there was frames in icebergs that were shot 30 years later. And I still, I heard from the great man twice over about both outcomes. So it's one of those things that, I mean, it's also interesting. Sorry to extrapolate on that. When I did my first international magazine assignment, which wasn't for National Geographic, the company, it was an African magazine, and they said you can go anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa. We don't need Northern Africa shot at the moment. So I picked Namibia, and I picked Namibia because of a plant called Welwitschia mirabilis. And that's one of the only plant Latins that I know. But it's a desert plant that lives in the Namib, which is the oldest desert on Earth. And the super chilled water in Antarctica sinks to the ocean floor and travels north along the Benguela Current, and it surfaces off the coast of the Namib Desert, bringing all these super nutrients. So the fog rolls over the desert because it's a desert, and then all these ancient plants, which live for thousands of years, all the little tendrils absorb the fog. That's how they get their moisture. I'd seen this on David Attenborough's Trials of Life as a kid. I must have been like really young because I was into wildlife and nature very young. And so when this company said to me, "Where do you want to go?" I said, "I want to go and see Welwitschia mirabilis," and they went, "Yeah, okay." And so that was before I'd even received a letter, obviously, from Sir David. But I remember sitting in the desert and looking at these plants, and it was a circular moment for me at that point in my career, and I was probably 21 or something maybe, and I gently lifted one of these plants because they are national treasures, and underneath was an orange and black beetle. So I took a photo of the beetle, and then when the beetle moved on, there was an orange mite that had been living on the belly of the beetle. So I took a picture of the orange mite. They're terrible photos, of course, but it was one of those things where I went, wow, one lives for weeks, one lives for 5,000 years.
Yeah, fascinating stuff indeed. Um, I want to tell our listeners that this is not just an absolute gorgeous photography book. There's also poetry in it. I mean, I think that the one of the similarities between poetry and photography is the poet's eye, the be able to notice small details and be able to understand them and convey those. And I'm wondering if that's feels the right thing to you.
I very much appreciate the analogy. Thank you. I mean, that means my pictures are doing the right thing if that's the case. I mean, some photographers set out to how would you put it? Some want to document the struggle or to do landscape or whatever the case might be. For me, I've done so many genres in my travels, but I guess my hope is always that even if the subject matter is difficult, and I've shot some very difficult subject matter in my career, but I'm hoping that through the composition and the lighting, which I don't manipulate, that there is some sort of song that comes through to the person that doesn't have the opportunities that I have. And that's the big thing for me. I'm brutally hard on myself, brutally hard. If I think I've missed an opportunity and or the shot, I just haven't thought it through well enough or worked hard enough for it, although that's not often the case. But it's one of those things that I'm very aware that what I do is a privilege, even if I'm doing it at great financial sacrifice sometimes, it's one of those things that if the images and the words, because there's journal entries and things like that in the book, and some of the captions were journal entries, but we just took the dates off them. It's one of those things that I'm hoping that it gives people, lifts people up, because not all the stories that will be in this book or future books will be positive, and not all the stories in this book are positive. But at the same point in time, I think the world's an amazing place, not just because I get to travel it and see it, but it's not all dark and destruction and doom and things like that. That's just not how I see the world at all. And I've tried to make a career for myself, and thankfully, I had a modicum of skill, I guess, and made something out of it. But I hope the pictures sing to people and connect them sometimes with places they'll never go themselves.
You have, I mean, there's a kind of a meme out there that says you have to suffer to produce great art. But I think in your case, it's a byproduct, not a cause. I mean, you've been ill, you almost lost a leg at one point,
Yeah.
and yet you just keep on going.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't do it for the money, but and you wouldn't do it if you knew what has happened to my body over the years. I mean, I had pneumonia this year. I had insect larvas living in an ear. I'm always parts of my body stitched back on and pick a disease, and I've got it, and you can hear in my voice now. I just got off the road, and all the adrenaline ran out of me, and so I'm a bit run down. But I think I have very little genetic self-preservation material in my DNA is probably the best way to put it. I've never ever hit that point where I've gone, this is not a good look, or well, actually I've hit that point, but I'm also not oblivious to the fact that, death is death, and things changed once I became a father. I couldn't stop doing what I was doing. It's like the old fable of the scorpion and the frog. You know that one?
Oh, absolutely, because
Yeah.
this is the Middle East. Yes.
Yeah, and so it's when you're the scorpion, you're the scorpion at any cost,
Yeah.
and so it's one of those things. If I look back at what I've done to myself and the diseases and the rebuilds that I've had, you wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. But having said that, I have this freaky ability. I'm going to touch wood here, but I have this freaky ability to heal. But also too, it's like it's who I am, and even if I want to be at home with my family and I'm tired and exhausted, and there's so many frames to look at from shoots I haven't seen yet and things like that, it is still one of those scenarios where the universe will call me, and then all of a sudden, Nat Geo will say, "Hey, do you want to go here or there or wherever?" And I'll be back on a plane.
Is
You
there any
know,
place you haven't been
It's
that you would like to?
many. That's the irony that I've realized in my own travel life, and sometimes, I mean, I've got multiple shoots this year. I've been in everything from Central Africa to West Africa to Papua New Guinea this year. It's been a staggering year, but I've been bouncing, so I've not had the opportunity to go through some of those shoots yet because the timeline meant that I had to get on the next plane, which is again amazing. But it's what I've realized is that the more I travel, the bigger the world gets, not the smaller it gets. And that's the one of the things that keeps me on the road. There's two things that keep me on the road, really. Well, apart from starvation, I guess. And so call starvation number three. But one is that, the world gets larger. And secondly, is that I repeat my visits often to countries where I've got long-term stories. So the Serengeti's in the book, and that'll be a book by itself. The Antarctic Peninsula and the Andes is in the book. That'll be a book by itself at some point. So I find myself returning, which means that potentially there's areas that I'll never get to.
Mhm.
And when I was younger, I didn't have to say that I'd been to every country, but I thought, I'll get to everything. And I've been to a lot of countries, but for me, the difference is that I'm not on holidays.
Mhm.
A lot of people come to me and go, oh, I've been to this many countries or whatever. I mean, I don't know. I stopped counting at 70. I don't know. It could be 100. I don't even know what it is.
Yeah.
But for me, I'm actually there to work and to immerse myself. If I've got 5 minutes, I immerse myself in the culture for 5 minutes, and I'll do that as deeply as I can in five. If I've got 5 weeks, I'll do it over 5 weeks. I'm not actually bouncing through Europe or Asia drinking margaritas on the beach on holiday. I'm actually working, and travel for work, as you would know, is very, very different. And so I think, there's so many places that I'd love to go. One of the interesting things is I don't get sent to the boreal forest by National Geographic. I'd love to do northern Russia or, across that Bering Sea and into, the high Arctic in the North Americas and things like that. It's like, I'll do it, of course, but, that's a hole in, I guess, in my map because Geographic have people that live in
Yeah.
Alaska or Canada or whatever. They can bounce up for $300 as opposed to me going for $3,000 or
Yeah.
something. So there will always be spaces, but the one analogy I would give you on that is that have you seen The Adventures of Walter Mitty or the Walter Mitty movie with Ben Stiller?
I have not. I know the book, though.
Yeah,
What
the
is
book, of course.
yeah.
Yeah, the book is a wonderful book. So if you watch that movie, and this is not letting anything out of the bag, but when that movie came out, people would call me and say, "Wow, your life is like Walter Mitty." It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful movie. I can't recommend it enough. It's the special effects are wonderful, but the story is lovely. But Sean Penn is in the movie, and Walter Mitty encounters Sean Penn on a mountainside where Sean Penn is trying to photograph something. And Sean Penn's reaction to a failed exercise is a lot where I find myself these days, that I'm happy to, I don't want to miss anything, but I've been on the road for so long and captured so many frames that not only do I have to find everything interesting and beautiful at some level, even if it's horrific, I have to try and document it, but I also have to find something at a spiritual level for myself, because I'm away from my family and friends and from a bed, and you get lonely and you get sick. So I often, when that movie came out, the people who knew me well said, Jace, wow, you've turned into haggard old Sean Penn. And they're probably right. So if you
Oh,
watch the movie, you
yeah,
maybe keep that in mind. Yeah.
I'll do that. I think I try to find the telling phrase, and I read the books cover to cover and make notes. I've got about 8 pages of notes in single space type on you. The line that got to me, it says, "Photography is not what I do, it's who I am." That's you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's a look, to know what you love and to get to do it as a career, you are automatically 100% blessed, aren't you? It's one of those things that most people go through life not even knowing what they want to do. I had that epiphany at 15, walking to school, going, wow, I want to make pictures for a living. And it was a lot of work and a lot of suffering and a lot of sacrifice by myself and others. But it was such a good fit for me that I never had to take the glove off again.
Yeah.
I've never questioned the life.
It's been good for you, and it's been good for us because you produced all this wonderful thing. And I'm about out of time here today, but I do want to mention a couple of things. One is the book is absolutely drop dead gorgeous. It's laid out incredibly well. It's got wonderful comment all the way through by you, and I highly recommend it. But I also want to mention some of the other things. You've got a website. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so my website is the website that every other photographer says you need to do more work on your website. But given the choice, I'd be on a plane rather than a website. But jasonedwards.co, so that's CO for company, jasonedwards.co. So you can always pick up the book, and there's some fine art prints there. But of course, people call me and say, "Have you got a picture of this?" Of course, if they want a fine art print that's not there, just call me and we start the dialogue. So the book's available there. If you order it through the website, I'll sign and dedicate it for you if that's what you like. But it's also available on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, and all really good independent bookstores. So they can order it in for you if it's not there.
Great. I thank our guest today, Jason Edwards. The book is Icebergs to Iguanas, Photographic Journeys Around the World. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, mate. Thank you for having me.
All right, it's going to cut out in the 30 seconds. Thank you so much. We'll get a copy of this once we get it online. Love talking with you. You're an awesome
You,
guy.
thanks, mate, and amazing talking to you too. Thanks for being so insightful. It's been quite touching talking to you.
All right, you take care, my friend.
Thanks, buddy. Cheers, mate.
Yeah.